In this context, it is evident that the modern intellectual person seems to be so much more dependent upon his milieu than was the case previously, and this is true not only in the sense that, educationally, he is qualitatively more specialized but also in the sense that the development of his specific energies, his internal productivity, his personal quality is not possible without particularly favorable conditions of life that suit him as an individual. The unbelievably humble circumstances under which, in earlier times, a highly intellectual life often developed would be oppressive to the vast majority of present-day intellectual workers. They would not find in such circumstances the encouragements and stimulants that they need, sometimes each one different from the other, for their individual production. This is completely at odds with any Epicureanism and perhaps arises as the genuine precondition for achievement, on the one hand out of the enlarged sensitivity and weakness of the nervous system and on the other out of the accentuated individualization which cannot react upon that simple, that is, typical general life stimulus, but rather emerges only out of specifically individualized stimuli. If the most recent times have implemented the historical milieu theory as the most decisive, then here two real circumstances, through their exaggeration of one element, may have opened up to us the view of its reality at the levels of its more limited development in exactly the same way as the real increased importance of the masses in the 19th century first became the occasion for making us scientifically aware of their importance in all earlier epochs as well. In that these circumstances exist, there really is a certain proportion between the values that we consume and those that we produce, that is, the latter, as intellectual achievements, are functions of muscular inputs which are invested in the former. The value of physical activity reducible to that of mental activity, however, this possible reduction of the values of mental labor to those of physical labor is very soon confronted with limitations from many sides. First of all, this proportion is certainly not reversible. Very considerable personal expenditures belong to specific achievements, but such expenditures for their part do not everywhere produce these achievements. The untalented person, transposed to equally favorable and refined living conditions, will nonetheless never achieve what the talented person can achieve under the same conditions. The series of products thus could be a constant function of the series of expenditures only if the latter resulted in the circumstance of natural personal talents. Yet if the impossible itself were to occur, namely that personal talents were permitted to be exactly produced and an ideal adaptation, measured exactly according to this establishment of the means of subsistence, were to be made the index of the extent of achievements, then this undertaking would always find its limits in the lack of equivalence in the conditions of existence which themselves exist between persons qualified for the same performances. Herein lies one of the major limitations upon social justice. Just as it is certain that, in general, the higher intellectual achievement also requires better living conditions, so human talents in the very claims that the development of their highest energies make are themselves extremely unequal. Of two natures that are capable of an objectively similar achievement, the one must necessarily, according to its level, have a completely different milieu, completely different material preconditions, completely different stimuli for the realization of this possibility compared with the other. This fact, which establishes an irreconcilable disharmony between the ideals of quality and justice and the maximization of tasks, is still by no means sufficiently taken into account. The diversity of our physical mental structures, the relationships between efficient and restricting energies, the interaction between the intellect and the nature of the will results in the fact that the achievement, as a product of the personality and its living conditions, finds a highly inconsistent factor in the former, so that, in order to produce the same result, the other factor must also suffer particularly large variations. And it certainly seems as if these natural differences in relation to the conditions of realization of their inner possibilities are more considerable the higher, the more complex and the more intellectual is the sphere of achievement. The people who possess only muscle power for a specific work activity will require for its realization roughly the same nourishment and general standard of life. However, where leading, intellectual abstract activities are in question, the diversity between all those who ultimately could achieve the same comes to the fore as being important. Personal talent is so variable that the same external circumstances act upon it, produce the most diverse end results and thereby make the comparison of one individual with another, of each value proportion between the material conditions of life and the mental achievements built upon them completely illusory. Only where major historical epochs or whole classes of people can be compared with one another as averages can the relative extent of physically creatable conditions exhibit the same relationship as that of mental achievements. Thus, for example, one can observe that, where very low prices for necessary foodstuffs prevail, the culture as a whole progresses only slowly, and luxury articles, in which a considerable amount of mental labor is invested, are extremely dear. In contrast, increases in the price of basic foodstuffs usually go hand in hand with a reduction in the price and further increase in luxuries. It is characteristic of lower cultures that indispensable foodstuffs are very cheap, whereas higher means of life are very expensive, as is still the case, for example, in Russia in comparison with Central Europe. The cheapness of bread, meat and shelter, on the one hand, does not create the pressure that forces the worker to struggle for higher wages, whereas the expensiveness of luxury goods, on the other hand, pushes these goods completely out of his view and prevents their dissemination. It is primarily making dear what was originally cheap and making cheap what was originally dear. I have already shown the connection between the two that implies and bring about an increase in intellectual activities. Beneath all the enormous incommensurability of individual elements, these proportions nonetheless reveal a general relationship, one that takes effect in these individual elements between physical and mental labor, that would certainly allow the amount of value of the latter to be expressed through the former if its effectiveness were not drowned out by the much stronger force of individual differences in talent. Finally, there is a third standpoint from which the reduction of all labor value to the value of manual labor reveals its crude and plebeian character. If we look more closely upon what it is that really makes physical labor valid as value and expenditure, then it follows that this is certainly not a pure physical achievement of strength. By this I do not mean what has already been referred to, namely, that as such this would be quite useless for human purposes without a certain intellectual guidance. From this standpoint, however, the mental element remains a mere value admixture, and the genuine value could still reside in the purely physical, except that, in order to receive the necessary guidance, it would require this additional element. Rather, I mean that physical labor acquires its whole tone of value and valuableness only through the expenditure of mental energy embodied in it. If all work, viewed externally, implies the overcoming of obstacles, the formation of matter into a form that it did not originally possess but that it at first resisted, then the internal side of work exhibits the same form. Work is certainly effort, burden and difficulty. Therefore, where it is none of these things, it is usual to assert that it is not really work at all. Viewed from the standpoint of its meaning for the emotions, work consists of the progressive overcoming of the impulse towards laziness, enjoyment and the relaxation of life. In this context it is irrelevant that this impulse, if one really continuously gave way to it, would similarly make life into a burden. For the burden of not working is experienced only in the rarest exceptional cases, whereas the burden of working is almost always felt. Therefore no one is accustomed to taking on the pain and effort of work upon themselves without receiving something for it in exchange.